So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to have you here for the last of our monthly lectures, which is not the last of our events for this semester, but it's the last of our monthly lectures. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome Ayse Caglar, who is a new permanent fellow at the Institute since last September. Most of you know her from her professorship at the University of Vienna at the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology. So in a way, it's not that I'm introducing somebody unknown to you, but for us, it's the first occasion on which she's speaking as a new permanent fellow. She's already spoken at the Institute before, but this is a particularly happy occasion for us to have one of the permanent fellows addressing an audience, talking about their own work, but also talking about the kind of topics they will be addressing at the Institute, the kind of research program that they will be building up here. And so in that sense, it's also a part of the programmatic forecast for the Institute. Ayse and I go back a long way, so I'm also introducing a very good personal friend. We started together at the university in Berlin, at the Free University, at the Department of Anthropology. And after that, we were together, overlapped very briefly at the Central European University. So we've had multiple overlaps as far as cities, as far as universities, as institutions are concerned. Ayse has been here longer than me, much longer. In Vienna, and I'm very, very glad she agreed to join us as a permanent fellow last year. She's had visiting professors, many of them at the University of Stockholm, in Zurich, at the CEU, at the Donau University in Krems, and she was Jean Monnet Fellow at the EUI in Florence. She has another association with the Institutes of Advanced Studies because she used to be on the advisory board of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And she's currently on the advisory board of the NCCR, the National Centers of Competence in Research in Switzerland, established by the Swiss National Foundation on, I think it's called On the Move. It's the NCCR on mobilities and migration. She is on the editorial board of the American Ethnologist, on Focal, editorial board of Anthropological Theory, and the International Journal of Political Sociology, besides the new perspectives on Turkey. So let me just say three things about her work, because she's going to talk about it in much greater detail here today. She began by looking at the whole question of diasporic communities, the Turkish migrants in Germany. And very early, this is already in the early 90s, I remember the first working paper of the Institute of the Free University in Berlin was titled Through the Prism of Culture, and it was looking at an anti-culturalist argument, making an anti-culturalist argument with regard to migration. So it made a very, very early argument about not using the prism of culture to look at the lives and experiences of migrants, and basically making a very strong argument against identifying the migrants as a problem. So migration and migrants as a problem for the receiving countries was something that she challenged very early on in her career. And I think this is a topic which is still topical, unfortunately, as those of us who are migrants know all too well, but even those who are not may by now be aware of some of the social science scholarship on the area. So in her 2011 book with Nina Glick-Schiller, Locating Migration, Rescaling Cities and Migrants, she brings together her two interests today, and that is her interest in urban theory, urban studies, as well as migration studies. It looks at urban restructuring and situates migrants in these processes of urban restructuring, looking at neoliberal reconfigurations of the city and trying to show the why and how city scale, locality, but in particular the city scale matters. And the basic idea is to also methodologically to turn cities into the unit of analysis through which to look at migration, rather than the methodologically nationalist alternative of looking at nation states as the only units of analysis, or transnational communities as units of analysis for comparative studies of migration. So in her new book, Migrants and City Making, Dispossession, Displacement and Urban Regeneration, which came out with Duke University last year, it's also an important work because it goes against the one major strand in migration research, which we hear constantly also in the public comments on migration. The problem of migration is a problem of integration. So it's as if there is a city or a country or a society into which somehow migrants don't belong. They are peripheral. Something needs to be done by the state in order to integrate those who are whose belongings are questionable, whose identities don't fit, and whose lives actually are relatively marginal to the city. Against that conventional view of migration and integration, the book argues, looking at material in several cities, that we need to really think about the role of migrants as city makers. Migrants who are urban developers, migrants and their relationship to municipality and municipal local politics, looking at migrant business owners, the business community, social justice movement, and finally, contentious politics in the city. And that brings me to my last point, and that is we look forward not only to the talk this evening, but we also look forward to a new book that Ayse will edit for us in our new series with Passagen Verlag on austerity, precarious migrant lives, and urban restructuring. So it will be about contentious urban politics and migration. So this will come out in autumn. In German, it will be, I think, one of the really groundbreaking collections on the subject, bringing together the questions of migration and urban studies together for the first time in a German publication. So thank you very much for being with us, and you have the floor.
Much, Shalini, for your generous and introduction. I feel like that I should not talk about anything about in terms of my work. What I would talk about today is that draws from the last book, and a lot actually, but I would like to move to a kind of a terrain which I am myself not so sure in terms of then collecting some material. So I thought that why not to get some kind of feedback also to present on my ideas. Actually, I had almost forgotten that anyone had remembered that the first German publication actually that I had was that Kultur als Zwangsjacke, and then and it came in the working paper, but I think it was the very first thing that I wrote in Germany. So what I would like to talk about is that today, that together with the rise of right-wing popular support, there has been a kind of an increasing attention on the deepening of social, economic, demographic cleavages between cities of different scale. And the cleavages are between urban growth clusters, the growth clusters, cities, metropoles, and as if that the metropoles and the rest, cities, mid-sized cities, small town cities, or the rural areas. People, these places that are often referred as left behind places, they are characterized, of course, by economic stagnation, decline, depopulation, high unemployment, and entrenched poverty, they came to be seen as engines of right-wing support that have articulated their revenge actually in Trump's 2016 election victory, or that the exit vote in the Brexit referendum. And these places have almost became a kind of a trope about talking about discussing populism and inequalities, and they have acquired increasing attention in scholarship, but also in policies. For example, recently, I think Brookings Institute had several policy papers about taking this as a problem. So, but though the divergences between the cities of different scale in terms of concentration of capital and growth have drastically increased since 2018, but this with an accelerating pace, but this has been going on since 1980s, definitely. This, the decline of former industrial towns and the changing social, economic, and cultural geography of cities were closely related with the industrial restructuring and the passage to finance and service economies. And this uneven development across space that we see between cities was closely related to the remaking of the geography of state power in the context of globalization, in globalization's uneven spatiality. Interestingly, so these are not a kind of it's a kind of a long process that has been with us. Interestingly, in the depiction of the rise of right-wing support in these economically troubled cities, through though migration has a very strong discursive presence in these discussions, but less attention is paid to migrants themselves in their location in the making and remaking of these economic, social, cultural, and political fabric of these cities. And this kind of a disregard is very interesting and is problematic for several reasons, for empirical and for theoretical reasons. For empirical reasons, we know that there has been empirically it has been demonstrated that there has been an increasing trend of migrant settlement in mostly depopulated small and mid-sized towns and in rural areas, starting from the 80s, in the second half of the 80s, but particularly since 1990s. So empirically, there is this group of people, migrants are settling in this kind of places. And furthermore, not only migrants are increasingly settling in these places, many of such depopulated and declining cities actively recruit and welcome the migrants as part of their efforts to repopulate and revive their cities. Here I think I have to make a note, because I am not here referring to the cities of refuge or sanctuary cities or cities of solidarity. Instead, what I am referring to is cities that are part of collaborations like Welcome America, network of city governments. These are networks of mayors where the NGOs are involved. The Welcome America was established in 2009, and which have the mottos that connect welcoming to prosperity. So that is, and we have several kinds of those welcoming networks, cities in US and in Europe. And these cities are the ones that the depopulated, stagnated, and cities of economic and social decline. And this omission is disregarding is also so empirically it is surprising, and theoretically it is again striking, because as Shalini had referred to it, that with the still it shows the persistent grip of methodological nationalism in terms of not looking of methodological nationalism of migration and urban scholarship. So in terms of not taking the judicial and economic fracturation of the state territory in terms of its opportunities that it provides to the migrants and migrant settlement, and still trying to drive the theories on the basis of metropoles or gateway cities. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that there is no research on that. I mean, Luisa is one person actually who has that kind of research, but it is interesting that the territorial advantages created by the competitive state is still being disregarded in migration and cities research. So in my talk, what I would do is that, based on a comparative research we had done together with my long-term co-author, Shalini had referred to, mentioned Nina Glick-Schiller, I would focus on migrants in city making, in particular kind of economically troubled, declining cities, which we have called disempowered. Here, following our work, I use the term city making to speak about the multiple ongoing connected processes and relationships of urban restructuring, regeneration, and rebranding as they develop in time and space. These processes are part of cities' efforts to generate wealth in the context of globalization. I'm not saying that city making should have been defined that way throughout history, but in our current period within the context of globalization, where that the cities, in terms of, this is the major way of cities generating their wealth. So here, in terms of that, with the disempoweredness, that size, which we know that it is, although related, is not a good indicator of power. So for this reason, although in most of the literature, in the discussing the left behind places, in terms of decline, the contrasts are very often done in relation to cities of different size, and bigger metropoles and mid-sized cities and small-sized cities. But I don't think that really size and power could be put immediately together. I mean, very easily, Zurich is a very small city and a very powerful city. So we, what do we mean by disempowered? Disempowered cities is they are marked by decimated economies, loss of population, of course, and loss of the population, also loss of tax base. However, what defines them is the loss of their economic, political, and cultural power. These cities are disempowered in terms of their access to national power, capital, and investments, and global talent, human capital. These are, of course, it's clear that they are cities with very limited resources available for their residents. And here I think it is important to underline that these are not simply powerless cities. They, first of all, not only used to be powerful, but they also have a memory of powerful days gone. So, and they are able to relate to those that powerful days, and also what I think it is important that they have an infrastructure, though often decaying, as they're reminiscent of both the powerful past but also the materiality of the abandonment and decline. So there is this materiality of the grandeur days gone, but which were there, but also this process of abandonment. And I think this materiality is important. And why it is important? I think it is important to understand the affective investments as well as the disappointments of the process of urban regeneration in these places. And they are important for the narratives and imaginations of successful past in today's anger and resentment. So they, in a way, crystallize that kind of the resentment and then the anger. You could say that, why are you making this kind of a fuss with this disempowered cities? Most deindustrialized cities are actually what you're talking about is the deindustrialized cities. Yes, there is a truth in that, but not all disempowered cities are former industrial cities. Cities might have had their power on the basis of commerce as being the nodes of trade, commerce, or religious institutions, learning. So they might have had their power on that base. So although it overlaps, but it is not necessarily disempowered cities could be equated to deindustrialized cities. But what is the use of looking through the lens of disempowered cities? I think it is especially looking through the lens of these cities which had the welcoming narrative that I was talking at the beginning, which I will come back at the end of the talk. They might, looking at this combination that is within the disempowered ones, with the welcoming narrative, it might be fruitful, I think, to provide insights into the dynamics, contradictions, and effects of underlying urban redevelopment in these places, and they might give us insights how these processes might build inroads to the rise of polarized politics in declining cities. So this is actually what bothers me. How could we understand that why these cities become it is in a particular way in terms of this kind of polarized politics? And if you want, the injuries of neoliberal urbanisms could become much more visible and acute in these kind of disempowered cities than more powerful metropoles. And in the more powerful cities, you have the finance and the service industries. You have something else to fall back, although these dynamics, that we know that they are there. And I think studying migrants in cities of limited resources might provide new insights into the different opportunities, ironically related with the disempoweredness of these cities that emerge, that might create spaces for local politics. So in that sense, I think it might be interesting to look at them. So in our research, we look comparatively at the urban regeneration processes geared to overcome the economic and social decline in three such disempowered cities located in different parts of the world, and which had different histories. I mean, they are in the places in Germany, US, and Turkey, where you have very different policies, histories, legacies of migration. One of them was Manchester, New Hampshire, not Manchester, UK. I still get some messages from people saying that, but I looked at Manchester, I found this, and then this is Manchester, UK that they are sending me. And the other one is Halle Saale in the former GDR. Today, I mean, today is in Federal Republic Germany, and Mardin, Turkey, on the border of Turkey and Syria. This is Manchester, so you could see that how it is in New Hampshire, and then of course the giant there is Boston. And then the Halle, it is for Halle, actually the giant might be, that is the most competing one. That's, I mean, of course, the what hounds is Berlin, but basically more than Berlin, it is Leipzig. I will come back to it. And Mardin is actually on the border of Syria, where you could see its location. I will come back to these ones. And let me tell you a little bit about, very much in a nutshell, about very briefly about their disempowerment and what they had, and then what happened. Manchester, New Hampshire had been site of a massive textile mills and of factories for production of machine tools and shoes in the 19th century and early 20th century. Actually, the decline of Manchester started with the industry leaving for places where labor was not unionized, and that's why it was cheap. And in the second half of the 20th century, and that it had ups and downs, but in the last since 1980s, you could say that it is a deindustrialized, shrinking city with an increasingly abundant city center. The abandonment of the city center is very visible, and it is about that 110,000 population. And when we started, that the percentage of the foreign-born, actually, this is always the problem with the statistics, and Manchester was that the 8%. All these places that I'm talking about have very few, actually, in terms of percentage, that very low percentage of actually migrants. And Halle had been a site of science, industry, and had a far-reaching trade networks that began hundreds of years ago. And that all this collapsed, came to an end with the 1989, and then afterwards with the German unification, that the decline of the city is with the German unification. And although Halle started losing towards Leipzig before 1989, but it became to a drastic end. The city lost its economic power, that factory, commercial, and government workers, as well as many professionals, lost their jobs and found themselves displaced. And the depopulated city came to be closely associated with racism in the 1990s. And Mardin, it used to be a powerful center of trade, commerce and arts and religious education and learning, located at the crossroads of historical Silk Road, and it was a very important center of commerce until World War I. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the massacres and the genocides that on the local Armenian population and the Syriac Christians changed the demography of the population drastically. And with the establishment of Turkish Republic and basically the establishment of the border between Iraq, between Syria and then the Iraq, that the city lost its regional economic and social ties, and it became a marginalized border city, and it was very closely connected to violence and terror. And one of the reasons is that, of course, not least that it was the seedbed of those kind of massacres and genocides, but also the armed conflict between the Kurdish forces and the military was very much behind this kind of a very strong association with violence, but also poverty. At the turn of the millennium, all these cities, and then in Mardin, actually, the kind of the migrants, and especially these are the returnees that I'm referring to, Syriac Christians, it is really, really a minor fraction. And this again tells us a lot about that. Driving everything in terms of the proportions, in terms of the numbers present, is not always does not always work. At the turn of the millennium, all the three cities have embarked on an orchestrated efforts to alter their local global connectedness, to generate wealth and empowerment, and to alter their negative image in terms of terror, poverty, racism, and abandonment. When we look at these orchestrated efforts in these cities to revive their economies through a series of urban renewal projects to make themselves global players, actually they all in their documents talk about that they want to become global players, and or at least to make these places regional service centers to overcome their stagnation. And we see very clearly the process of accruing capital, which Harvey formulated as accumulation by dispossession. Dispossessions entangled with the form of urban regeneration and its resulting displacements have become central to capital accumulation that Harvey refers to, were very much in play there. Actually, we saw kind of textbook examples of growth coalitions composed of local political and business elite, marshalling the powers of the local state, the federal funding in service of business interests through public-private partnerships. The typical mechanisms of neoliberalism were all there. Provision of public subsidies for private development to serve individual or corporate rather than public interests in the form of corporate tax incentives, capital subsidies, or provisioning of commons or public land to corporations under market prices. Projects of urban renewal. This is, if you have worked on those areas, that is really a very common kind of process. And this resulted, like in many places, in dispossessions, leading to displacements in the form of downward social mobility and growing disparities and precarity of both migrants and non-migrants, actually majority of the urban residents. And due to the disempowered nature of these cities, the effects of these displacements were felt more drastically than well-resourced cities. And why to use that Harvey's, that's accumulation by dispossession, that conceptual network, I think, allows us to address the processes of wealth generation, and this is what the cities are trying, through urban development, inequalities, and migrant settlement. Harvey is not talking about the migrant settlement in the way that he looks at it, but there is no reason not to put it. And this kind of a lens is important in facilitating us first, I think, to capture the interdependencies among these processes, as well as the resulting common conditions of precarity and displacements, which mark the lives of these people. We could still ask, what is the advantage of telling the story of migration and city making through the lens of accumulation by dispossession? I think this analytical lens allows us to make not only these interrelated processes, to look at them, but to make them, these processes are usually obscured by the concept of mobility and by the urban redevelopment narratives of so-called urban turn. So they enable us to make the interrelated processes visible. In this case, then we can tell the story of population movements within a narrative of systematic dispossessions and displacements resulting from the erosion of livelihoods, but also from wars, underlying migration. So you could start telling the story of migration through displacements and dispossessions and displacements. And that enables us to connect them and urban regeneration processes. And then once you try to connect, which the mobility lens disconnects, actually if you connect them, then you could start seeing how seemingly independent places and processes are intimately connected with each other. So how we tell the stories of population movements, migration, and the cities and the migrants in these processes matters. Our framings not only determine what we reveal and obscure, but the semantics of dividing, thinking about difference, connections, commonalities, and sociabilities among city residents. In short, I think the lens of accumulation by dispossession enables us to situate migrants and non-migrants within the same network transformative processes beyond native-stranger divide. So this is the moment that you bring that one, that is that you are bringing both the migrants and non-migrants, quote unquote, non-migrants into the same transformative processes. And why I think it is important to move beyond the native-stranger divide, because these are binaries of difference generated by national imaginaries that dominate political discourses, and they often establish the building blocks of antagonistic division of discursive field of populist politics in cities vis-a-vis migrants. Chantal Mouffe is not here, but this is, I think, it is very important that this is the native-stranger divide is the basis of that kind of antagonistic divisions. And what did we see in these three cities when we looked at them? We saw similarities despite differences. And here I'm going to talk about the similarities. We found first these two entangled welcoming narratives, migrant, refugee-friendly, and capital-friendly narratives. Remember at the beginning when I said welcome Europe, that how welcoming was connected to prosperity. So So what we found in these cities that the entanglement of these two narratives, you have those two narratives, but the capital business investment friendly narratives translated themselves into a program in terms of policies, in terms of incentives to attract capital and investment to the city. Migrant welcoming narratives did not translate themselves into anything in those places in terms of concrete programs or incentives with funding. So it just remained at the discursive level. But you have, it's a very entangled narrative. The capital-friendly incentives, when they translated themselves then into programs and policies, they became subsidies, tax rebates, abolishment of business and corporate taxes, provisioning of public resources, as I was talking, commons and treasury land. We found it in all three of those cities. So it was the city regeneration, this urban regeneration, which were to make the cities, was shaped by a very strong dependence on public funding. You could say that, oh, this is the game in town. Everywhere you have that kind of, and especially in the neoliberal urbanism kind of, I'm using it in quotations, but in terms of these but these are the basics of it. If you look at it, you will find it everywhere. But we are talking about places where that the public funding was very weak to start with. We are talking about disempowered cities. So just to give a brief example, the subsidies, labor conditions, and tax rebates offered to corporate investors in Mardin lowered the cost of labor for investors about 60%. Which, of course, had a drastic impact on the city debt, because these were the social security insurance costs which were taken by the city to attract the capital. So it was a very strong burden on the city. But such kind of policies were partly effective, and these cities attracted some corporate and private capital, and multinational investment. So it worked that in all those cities where we looked, capital came, there were investments, and there was also multinational capital. And interestingly, despite their small numbers, the migrants, refugees became very important in reaching out to some EU or housing and urban development funds that proved to be crucial for the city center development in all the cities we looked at. Again, if I were to give an example from Mardin, migrants also proved to be very important for Mardin to access to various institutions like EU, UNDP, World Bank, UNESCO, which in turn, and to their funds, which in turn played an important role in efforts by Mardin's leaders to restructure and regenerate the city. Also, they became crucial in altering the global connectedness of Mardin through their access to global Christian, Catholic, and Orthodox networks. There were peculiarities of Mardin involved, but we have seen similar kinds of outreach through that kind of altering the connectedness, nature of connectedness through the migrants. However, despite this success, success in the sense that, okay, they wanted the investment to attract capital and growth, that came. And I mean, varying levels, but they did. So it was successful. But despite this success, public revenue streams of these cities did not increase at all. On the contrary, all these regeneration projects left the three cities with even fewer resources for public services. So those attracted funds were channeled into rebuilding the rebuilding efforts, which, as I said, went to the coffers of developers, multinational corporations, and public-private partnerships. And in all the cities, the city debt drastically increased after a decade of urban projects of economic growth and after attraction of capital. So this in turn affected the city debt, local funds available for public services from education to transportation. All three cities ended to be ranked within the top 5 cities in which highest debt in their respective countries after a decade of urban regeneration and attraction of capital. Again, to give an example from Mardin, the exports that, I mean, there were different reasons for that. The exports increased that much, but exports increased 150%, and the share of the city within Turkey increased 10 times. Of course, never underestimate the Iraq wars there. They were very, very important for that. But together with the increase of the heritage industry, tourism industry, construction sector became the major driver. The real estate prices tripled, and again the city became so much debted that it was not even able to pay its soccer team. So, in all these cities, disparities and poverty increased and displacements intensified. These dynamics lead to 2 simultaneous developments, providing opportunities but also challenges to migrant emplacement in all 3 cities. So it's not just that kind of this, it happened this way, but there were 2 polarized, the simultaneous developments. First, in the context where the revenues decreased and the public resources eroded, these 2 entangled or simultaneous welcoming narratives played a very important role in the formation of polarized politics in these cities. The simultaneous migrant and foreign friendly narrative, together with the international business and multinational capital friendly narratives mobilized for development, paved the ground for increased racism in the city, in a way making the migrants as foreigners also, who were upfront in the welcoming narratives, were increasingly made the scapegoats of the effects of dispossessive dynamics of urban regeneration, explaining they became a very easy explanation for the lack of public services to city residents. And these entangled narratives contributed to popular anger and resentment of those with a racist juxtaposition of natives and strangers and the migrants. It is true that in these cities also, when I come back to what I was saying at the beginning in terms of these cities had that kind of the materiality of their grandeur and then decline, and it's in these cities the facades were renovated, city center was refurbished, but abandoned places from the powerful past were being restored and put in use. So there is that kind of an development going on, as if that the decline is being reversed. So you have again the materiality of it. But at the end of the day, the urban residents, all these remained more impoverished with fewer public services and increasing inequalities. And this welcoming narrative is, in terms of the migrants, is not necessarily, it's not just by coincidence, because this welcoming foreigners, migrants, emphasizing the world world openness and business-wise safety of these cities. You have to perform the safety of these cities. In terms of in Mardin, actually, this was very clear. How could you attract business where you have violence, where you have racism? So these are important to alter the image of the negative image of these cities. So within the context of these entangled narratives, migrants increasingly found their place as the scapegoat of the increased impoverishment. On the other hand, the disempoweredness of these cities ironically opened local spaces for politics for migrants and refugees. In the context of eroded public coffers, where no city resources were available in provisioning of migrant-specific programs, I said that they were never translated into anything, let alone religious, ethnic, community-based services. So there were no resources or programs for any kind of institutionalization of ethnic, religious, or cultural difference. So there were no programs actually for the institutionalization of difference. And ironically, this what is an outcome of the disempoweredness of these cities opened opportunities for migrants and refugees, together with the quote-unquote who identify themselves natives, to become part of local politics with broader claims of social justice beyond identity politics, without differentiating migrants and non-migrants. There was that kind of, which you could find in metropolitan, in metropoles, in gateway cities. And it is noteworthy that in Germany, one of the very first black German member of parliament, Vangelis knows it very well, who in fact arrived Germany as a refugee from Senegal, was elected from Halle, not from Frankfurt or in Berlin. So he was a public foreigner, he was courted that way, but at the end of the day, he was elected and he came to the parliament actually from SPD. Manchester, New Hampshire, not New York, elected the second Muslim citizen to a US state legislature. And the very first, and that was also, of course, a migrant, and the very first elected Syriac Christian woman mayor in Turkey was in Mardin, not in Istanbul or in Ankara. So if you look at it, why on earth on all those cities that you had some kinds of opportunities for local politics? Most importantly, I think you could say that, you could have all sorts of people from the migrant representatives, but most importantly, none of these political figures were elected on the basis of black, ethnic, or religious communitarian politics and constituencies, but on politics of social and historical justice, challenging the increasing disparities in their respective cities. All of them were actually addressing the increasing disparities and the inequalities of their cities. So after having walked you through the complex and entangled inroads of city making in disempowered cities, I think I would like to conclude with a very small grain of an optimistic note on the polarized politics in these cities. Though the economically troubled, stagnated cities are often portrayed as kinds of engines of right-wing support, these findings might provide us, I think, insights about these processes leading into growing polarizations with disparate affective states and various kinds of solidarities. In addition to the solidarities movements fueled by right-wing anger and resentment, which are clearly based on antagonistic division of the discursive field between us and them, natives and migrants, in these cities, migrants also became crucial in the emergence of contentious scripts and claims for social justice beyond any kind of antagonistic binaries of migrant, non-migrant in the landscape of politics in these cities. So I think I will end by saying that there might not only be rising right-wing movements, even at places which are seen to be swamped by right-wing popular support. You could think that I am an hopeless optimist, but I think I have seen, at least in these places where that right-wing had an anchoring, you have seen that kind of openings which might be beyond that the claim making in terms of social and historical justice. I think I will stop here, and thank you for your patience.
You want to stay there or sit? Would you prefer? You would just, oh, okay. So thank you very much for this very wide comparative lens on a number of issues, from migration to deindustrialization, depopulation, demographic changes, social economic changes, and tied into the whole politics of city making and of urban restructuring. Let me just open, first of all, 2 questions. Miloš has the first question, I think. Sarah wants to go? Okay.
Much, Ayse, for this fascinating and, for me as a jurist, totally new introduction to the exciting subject. I have a question for you. Listening to the process you're describing, urban regeneration being with very ambivalent outcome, I was wondering if the theory of self-organization plays a role, either as an analytical tool in the field you are working, or in the municipalities you're describing, that they had the ambition to build something bottom up after they failed, maybe, if I may say so, in a top-down process of, you gave the keyword neoliberalism and restructuring and finally only raising the public debt and so on. So, because if you think about the 1960s and 70s, at least in the regions I know, there was a big enthusiasm about planning, and that planning was always top-down and very much central. And then there was, during probably, I would assume, in the 1980s, a paradigm shift into the direction of self-organization, and later on with the complex structure of organized self-organization. So there is something top-down and bottom-up at the same time. And I was wondering if that plays in these 2 possibilities a role, either as an analytical tool or as a voluntary strategy from politics.
Okay, do you want me to respond immediately? Okay. In terms of this self-organization, it's a kind of, if you are referring to civil society, because we talk from bottom up usually, that the civil society, NGOs come into the picture. If you are referring to that, I could give a different response. If you refer to only small-scale self-organization and on the basis of that, like participatory planning, which is also goes to the other direction. But let me give you, in terms of the self-organization, how or civil society or NGOs bottom-up institutions, organizations play a role. For example, in terms of the making these places to attract the capital, that the civil bottom-up was very much mobilized to. It depends what kind of funds, what kind of areas you would like to reach. For example, from Mardin, I could easily give you a kind of an example which puzzled me at the beginning when I saw that there was the city council. And I said that the city council is city council. I mean, it's in the cities. Actually, it had the city name. It was a civil society organization called City Council. And then it was very interesting, and thankfully, actually, Seda, that I mean, who's here, and in one of the interviews that the Seda had done, that I was very much surprised with the City Council. And then afterwards, you look at it. This is an NGO, but this was a kind of a condition to access EU funds, so that the EU funds were not channeled. That in terms of that the local government, but there had to be those kind of collaborations, and they established this city council in the name of the city council, a civil society, which actually got the funds and then worked with this kind of the conglomerate. So they were part of those conglomerates, if you look at it in terms of civil society. But self-organization, again, it just depends on the kind of the scale. I don't want to give an impression that it is like no space for breathing, that everything will be captured and channeled into that way. But there is that kind of tendency. We also, for example, know from the whole refugee, quote-unquote, crisis, how the voluntary work were kind of co-opted and used, and there were very interesting parts of it, but they were also connected to a particular kind of a channel.
Work now? Yes, I think so. Thank you, Ayse, for a wonderful lecture that I think certainly made me think kind of very critically, not just about how we think of and study cities, but also how we think of politics today, because I think the two things are very well connected. And I guess I wanted to ask you two questions. The first one is, very much thinking about what you opened with, how there's very much the danger of essentializing not just people, populations, but also places. And this idea of whether, use the term disempowered cities, but we can think of abandoned cities, the famous losers of globalization, whether geographical losers or if we're referring to populations, and thinking how dangerous those categories are. They're certainly very kind of dominant in popular media discourses, but we as scholars also tend to kind of slide into using those categories. And if we think about even interpretations of the last set of elections, the European elections or even national elections, I mean, those tend to be used in precisely explaining, certain kinds of politics, which is very, very problematic. And I think you highlighted very nicely in your talk how there's much more going on to just saying, well, those are the abandoned cities, whether we're talking about Poland or France. And I'm just picking the two examples where this distinction was very kind of powerfully made. So I guess, the first question is, okay, how do we avoid as scholars into ourselves kind of lapsing into those very kind of simplistic categories? The second question, something that I really appreciated about your talk was this warning not to, let's say, separate the natives from the foreigners when studying cities, which we, in a sense, do as well. It's not just policymakers. I say we, those of us who study cities. So kind of focusing on, for example, the, kind of the situation of migrants, how they are made the object of rhetorics of right-wing movements, and then separating out entirely what is happening to the, quote, native population, rather than seeing the precarization of all, let's say, segments of the urban population within, kind of one analytical approach. And so, and I'm asking you this because this is something that I struggle with myself: is how can we go beyond that?
Thank you very much, Louisa. These are very, challenging questions, but very central questions, actually. In terms of, I'm very much with you that, this kind of left behind places, it becomes such a catch-all category. And if you look at it, there is also a kind of a patronizing and a kind of victimhood inscribed into these kinds of understanding, and very often it is used for the rural areas and white places. So actually it operates with very easy categories. And this abandonment which we have seen, that is with the iconic example of Detroit, is actually how it was turned into a kind of commodification and commercialization of that place. That is why I try to put it in terms of try to define the basic characteristics of those kind of cities which I referred to, disempowered ones, and one could, it should not give the idea that trying to make a typology. But I thought that is why it is important and to look at those cities where you could see these kind of disjunctures more easily than other places. But what I would be very much against is that, and which I am also myself, for example, with the 2009 article, Comparative Theory of Locality, that article made me very uneasy with the typology. And I really think that it is wrong to make that kind of top-scale cities, down-scale cities, and that kind. First of all, it's very dynamic, and these could only be as our entry points to be able to look at how these dynamics are played out in space and time. Having said that, not like this ethnographic kind of collections, every city is unique in itself, that the eigenologic discussion of the cities, that every city has its own logic. It might have own histories and legacies, but I think if we do it that way, then there is no comparison, and we could not see any kinds of trends. In terms of how to avoid those kind of typologies and the distinction between migrants and the non-migrants, this is always the basic problem, because you have to adopt a kind of in terms of terminology, you don't want to lump everyone together, but on the other hand, this is not the defining characteristics of these people's emplacement in the city-making dynamics. If you look at it, actually, for the neoliberalization, migrants played an incredible role in Manchester in terms of real estate markets, and before that the subprime mortgages, and where that the banks particularly used the migrants, and so and they were part of it. They are not this kind of the precarity is not the monopoly of migrants. That I think one should definitely avoid that. And if we do not see that, actually we would not be able to understand what the concerns of those people who are trying to articulate their rage and anger in relation to their precarities that they are subject to. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, Ayse, thank you very much, and I join the others in complimenting you on this talk. This is more of a comment with a maybe small question at the end, and it comes from the policy angle and from my previous work at the German Marshall Fund, which has had for many decades a robust urban program. And within the mission of the German Marshall Fund, of course, very simply put, is strengthening transatlantic relations. And within that context, putting cities together. And two facets to it. One, over these years, I think for 10 years, it's been looking comparatively at welcoming cultures in the US and in Europe, and both the differences and similarities. And we, when I was at the German Marshall Fund, were bringing together city officials, so both top-down and bottom-up, NGOs who were working on that. And the second facet of that has been looking similarly to what you're doing at kind of middle-range cities. One is the deindustrialization. So, for example, we were putting Detroit and Turin together. Of course, differences notable. Turin is still a strong car town, whereas Detroit, as we all know, lost 5 times its population and has undergone an urban renewal program, both through its city leadership, but also through the bottom-up economically and through civic activities, but also towns in Europe like Leipzig and Manchester. And so the goal was to bring these people to exchange experiences, to meet each other, and to see what they could do. So if you have been unaware of this, I'll gladly kind of give you information, because I think there's a whole wealth of material there, both in terms of written stuff, but also in the human contacts. The final little question is, have these interesting experiences, has there been any interaction, have some of these people met between Manchester, New Hampshire, Halle and Mardin? And if so, what have been some of the lessons? Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks a lot. In terms of, yes, I am aware of this kind of research, and there is a plethora of that kind of research, because cities came to the attention, of course, to everyone's attention, and in terms of the policy institutions and the policy makers. But there were lots of networks were established, city networks and kind of twinnings, putting particular cities together to learn from each other, and so that they exchange those kind of experiences and the fault lines and what they had. So I am aware of it, but I have not seen, looking at these cities in terms of that they like clusters of those kind of cities. I mean, for Ruhr, Brenner had done, but it's definitely not that kind of a perspective. It is more not sharing of the policies, or this learning from the cities is very much how the policies travel and where particular policies are useful. And if you look at it that way, Vienna is an interesting example, because Vienna got a lot of advice from Amsterdam. And there were kind of policy papers written on Vienna in terms of how to score, how to improve its its relations to the migrants, and especially also in the cultural sector. So from that, the Vienna learned a lot, and now Vienna is exporting this to China. These policies, city policies, are that being exported to China. So these were very much policy networks. And I'm aware, for example, as I said, that the Brookings Institute had starting with the Metropolitan Revolution. But Metropolitan Revolution actually partly, yes, true, because they become the engines of commerce, economy, and everything, but in a way masks the other dynamics which actually I was trying to talk about, which comes together with those programs, the inequalities. So yes, I am aware, and in terms of the mayors acquire a very important power, and it is not bad by itself, mayors having the power, because we have seen also in relation to the refugees what kind of differences they were able to do that. But I am not so sure whether those policy city networks or European capitals of culture networks, that they address the questions in this kind of a way. Their concerns are a little bit, not their concerns, but their lenses were a little bit different, I think.
So thanks, Ayse. I'm glad I was able to join, and my lecture was cancelled, so I couldn't attend yours. You highlighted, I very much tie in with all your argument. I'm very sympathetic with that. And I like particularly the fact that you highlighted the similarities across these elements. However, I would like to ask you about the differences, in the sense that you mentioned they are coexisting. So I was wondering which are the bordering elements, the elements which allow to distinguish and show how, I don't know, maybe different groups of migrants with different nationalities are treated differently. Are there deserving groups? Probably yes, probably not. It depends where and how. And and the second question, I was wondering that size matters, in the sense that you mentioned it's 8%, it's 3%. If this percentage rises substantially, would it change the context within which city making takes place, and in which direction eventually? So thank you.
In terms of what was your first question, was the differences between the in those places. Of course, that the differences from all this comparison, I mean, although we took it really in terms of the not taking it the nation state as the unit and then the city representing the nation state, so we showed the similarities despite the different nation states, but the nation states play still a very important role, and a very increasingly important role. One difference is that you could not, I mean, the changes and the whole urban regeneration and the empowerments that come along with that, because those urban regenerations come with certain kinds of empowering certain groups too. And deserving and undeserving is always part of it. How they could be toppled down, how they could be changed depending on the national context. We saw it in Mardin, that is after the the city had seen with the change of the historical conjuncture in a way within the Middle East and Turkey's positioning vis-a-vis EU, US, and to Middle East also, because Mardin is also a city where you have the NATO radar. And actually, for Mardin, I had to interview an ex-rector of ours who had written the reports for US. And so it is, at one point, it is a never it did not exist outside of those relations. And the moment that those relations change, and these relations are not everywhere the same. It is, Mardin is definitely not Halle, definitely not Halle, and Halle is definitely not Manchester. So there is this kind of abstraction for the comparative, but I would respond you in terms of the relationalities that they are embedded in. The moment that you have those kind of changes, actually these kinds of similarities fade out. So for Mardin, I could very easily say that the empowered and cherished groups lost their power, and cherishing, actually the co-mayor was in prison, was put, not a woman, but her co-mayor who was Kurdish, was put into prison, and all the investments stopped. And the regeneration for the access to UNESCO, these applications, all of them, those funds also stopped. So at one level, going back to Louisa's question, it is, yes, it is a kind of a disempowered city, but there's no meaning right now. I don't see very much meaning now that to look at it, how they are just actually developing this way or that way. So I would answer this way. And then the different groups and deservingness and undeservingness. That's why it's not a migrant as a category, migrant native as a category could never work, because deservingness and undeservingness is also within the quote-unquote native population, the homeless and long-time employment, and then that you have the very similar kinds of discourses and policies capturing them. And for one other point is in Manchester, when for the city center development, the refugees were very important for, as I said, to accessing home and urban HUD, housing and urban development, for that institution, but they were together with the disadvantaged groups, and this was together with the marginalized groups. This is how that the fundings were taken, and this was where actually the marginalized and the kind of it's not really homeless, but at the verge are put in those places to store the value and then to access the funds, and then they were the first ones who were displaced. So nowhere we saw that it was migrants and actually the natives category in terms of understanding these processes works.
Hi. I'm Scott Spector. I'm a fellow here for the rest of the week. And my question, well, I also wanted to say that I appreciated the talk, and it's getting me to think in a more complex way about some of the processes I thought I already understood. But and I also appreciated the diversity of your talk, the different things that you talk. And I wanted to ask about a few of those moments under the cover of the processes of mystification and demystification, because that's what you really got me thinking about. And the sort of the first moment has to do just with the selection of disempowered cities and the kind of assumed other of empowered cities. And the degrees to, I come from Detroit, and you've been mentioning Detroit, and just the degrees to which one takes for granted or forgets the devastation of the empowered cities, the ways in which the processes of accumulation, dispossession, and the urban turn that you referred to have made the most successful global cities, so almost uninhabitable in terms of, the expense, the homogeneity, the actual kind of vacuum for innovation, for different things happening, that has created the possibility for exactly these sorts of places to become stages for certain things to happen. As a moment of opportunity. But talking about those processes in these places requires a kind of analytical critique of what's happening in those supposedly, in those empowered cities, the negative aspects of those processes. And then the other moment, the political one that you referred to next and then referred back to several points, had to do with just things that we've been talking about a lot in terms of the kinds of people who took a populist turn or vote in certain ways in reaction against migrants. And, the assumption that it's these economic losers that are voting in these ways has been challenged and very, very successfully. And what has been interesting in all that research, although some of it contradicts other research, but one of the interesting outcomes has been the very high level of income of a lot of people who voted in these ways, although they came from these cities or areas around these deindustrialized cities. So people who made, in the United States where I'm from, it was, on average $70,000 a year was the income of people voting in these ways from these regions. And so it wasn't people who were directly impacted in these ways, but there was a kind of perception, which one is tempted to think of in terms of false consciousness, that force people to project onto the devastation that they were seeing a particular interpretation, which was at odds with the things that could really help those cities. And the final moment, the one that I'm really interested in, I thought the most sophisticated and fascinating part of your talk was when you introduced this idea of the entangled narratives to talk about the ways in which, or to get me to suddenly realize the ways in which there are processes that are at odds with one another in these three cities that you've looked at, and that, interestingly, obscure the transparency of their processes, so that the actors, project onto what they're seeing, and an interpretation that's at odds with what's really happening in terms of the development of those places. So the project would be one of demystification, and it's not clear to me what the solution would be to disentangle those narratives. But even that sounds, though, a little bit paternalistic, like, I want to enlighten them and get them to see, because, they aren't the same actors. I mean, people see that even where there is the prospect of development and change and innovation and activity and hope, that it's, as Kafka said, there's all the hope in the world, just not for us, It's not for the people who are disempowered in this way. So, I think there are ways in which our analysis we can be mystifying things for ourselves, but, as I implied in the 3 parts too, but, the question really is about how the project of demystification can work.
Okay, that is in terms of how the demystification can work, is that actually this is the the conceptual, the terminologies that we use are very important. And that's why with the left behind places, in a way puts everything, as you were saying, that everyone there is supporting, we all know what these people will be voting, and then what their uneasiness and what their profile is. And on the other hand, that what this left behind places does is that actually lets the metropoles off the hook. And in the metropoles you might have, and you do have, those kind of formations. But looking at it in terms of, this is why that trying to look at this, how to demystify is that definitely with the categories that one is using, and definitely not to work with the chains of equivalences of those discursive fields, because this is how the divisions of those discursive fields work, with those chains of equivalences. If you are white, if you are this, then you will be doing that if you are coming from that place. Doesn't hold. But the disempowered cities, that when I was trying to look at it through the lens of the disempowered cities, not to say that this is only happening there, but there, because of its conditions, that you could see these kinds of processes and formations maybe more clearly and more in terms of their contradictions and disjunctions. Most of these things are happening, of course, in the metropoles too. That is why they're being imprisoned to those kind of typologies is a very big danger, what Louisa was talking about, and this is part of the mystification. And for Detroit, yes, okay, this abandonment, and it became the iconographic of that, and the kind of icon of that abandonment. On the other hand, it is still very important to look at it, what portion of Detroit is bought by Chinese now, just for speculation, and in terms of vast land has been bought. So it sets very different dynamics too, while everyone is looking in terms of Detroit within a kind of from a template, in a way, from a template. So I think it is very important to look at it, how the wealth is generated there, and that's labyrinths and intricacies of that generation of wealth.
I'm going to call it a day for just this part of the discussion. There is wine and cheese downstairs, as those of you who are often here know, so we can carry on the discussion just one floor below. I thank you very much, Ayse, for this very fascinating and wide-ranging paper. Thank you very much for a very rich discussion. And I should invite you actually to the next event, which is a keynote by Michael Ignatieff this week as part of our conference on popular sovereignty and electoral politics and democratic majorities. And you'll find all the information on our website. Thank you very much for coming.